In the haunting words of former slave Harriet Jacobs, the slave girl is raised in an atmosphere of fear and cruelty. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. At just 14 or 15, she's bribed with gifts, or, if that fails, beaten and starved into submission. This story of sexual violence is just one of many, showing the widespread abuse Black women faced under slavery. Not all sexual encounters between masters and female slaves were considered rape by most definitions. Some involved concubinage or even long-term relationships, like that of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. However, scholars argue that even these seemingly affectionate relationships must be reconsidered within the context of slavery. The huge imbalance of power between the master and the slave complicates the idea of true consent. These consensual partnerships, like rape, were an exercise of white patriarchal authority. But what about the sexual relations between planter-class white women and slave men? Under what grim circumstances did they occur? How can we understand them in terms of power, agency, and consent? To answer these questions, we must delve into historical records with a focus on power dynamics, untangling the complexities of racial, class, and gender hierarchies. By examining how various and often conflicting sources of oppression and power are intertwined, we can see how someone with low status in one area can hold high status in another. This intersectional analysis reveals how social hierarchies are maintained. In the case of white women and Black men, we see how elite Southern white women used oppressive ideas of female purity and sexual submission to uphold racial hierarchy. If you found this exploration insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Planter-class white women were seen as the guardians of the home, responsible for upholding traditional Christian values and maintaining peace within the domestic sphere. They were valued for their homemaking abilities, maternal instinct, and, above all, their virtue. As one letter to a South Carolinian periodical for young women put it, "If a female possesses beauty, wealth, and, in short, all the accomplishments which wealth can purchase, without virtue, she is nothing worth. Her accomplishments may be admired by some for a little while, it is true, but she will never be truly esteemed. Permit me to ask, which would you rather have, virtue without accomplishments or accomplishments without virtue?" Women were seen as physically and intellectually inferior to men, but much more pious, pure, and moral. This idea is echoed by a reverend in his address to the graduating class of the Sedgwick Female Seminary in Raleigh, North Carolina. "Leave men to themselves without the intermixture of female society and the softening influence of female modesty, gentleness, and affection, and they would infallibly become rude, harsh, coarse, quarrelsome, and in their quarrels cruel and unrelenting. The world would resemble an amphitheater of wild beasts." The honor and virtue attributed to Southern white women, especially of the upper class, were nearly synonymous with sexual purity, sustained by restraint, prudence, and modesty in every area of life. If you want to be fully convinced of the abominations of slavery, go on a Southern plantation and call yourself a Negro trader. Then there will be no concealment, and you will see and hear things that will seem to you impossible among human beings with immortal souls. White women's sexuality was heavily regulated by both law and culture. Adultery was considered a greater offense for women than for men and was punished more harshly. Similarly, giving birth out of wedlock was considered much more a social problem for white women than for anyone else. The Southern way of life, built on white supremacy, slavery, and the planter aristocracy, was deeply intertwined with the sexual regulation of women, especially those of the upper class. The purity of white women, contrasted with the sexually lascivious Black Jezebel archetype, was used to emphasize the supposed superiority of white womanhood, and by extension, whiteness. As historian Catherine Clinton observes, if plantation mistresses could live above reproach, their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers could boast of the superiority of their civilization. The sullying influence of slavery must not touch the women of the upper class, lest the entire structure crumble. This notion of elite white female sexual virtue was coupled with the idea of white female vulnerability, the belief that plantation wives and daughters needed to be protected, defended, and sheltered. Framing women in this way served as a means of patriarchal control. As political scientist Iris Young explains, the role of the masculine protector puts those protected, paradigmatically women and children, in a subordinate position of dependence and obedience. Indeed, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands. Their freedom and mobility were severely restricted. For example, they were generally not allowed to travel without an older male chaperone. Spousal abuse was often seen as a legitimate method for men to control their wives. Southern plantation mistresses were often called prisoners in disguise. While this might be an exaggeration, the fact remains that upper-class white women, despite the luxuries their race and class afforded them, faced a unique set of limiting patriarchal rules. Indeed, many plantation women were deeply unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation to remain dutiful, obedient, pleasant, and cheerful while their husbands had affairs with or raped female slaves. Knowing that the mixed-race slave children around them were their husbands' offspring was both humiliating and heartbreaking. Southern women, often married as young as 15 or 16, were frequently left abandoned on plantations while their husbands traveled for business, pleasure, or military duty. The life of a plantation mistress was often lonely and filled with sadness. While sexual relations between planter-class women and slaves were relatively uncommon, they did occur. Southern white women were sexually restricted compared to their male counterparts, and 19th century contraceptive methods were neither effective nor accessible enough to prevent pregnancy. However, the culture did not entirely repress female sexuality. Southern women, like their husbands, engaged in and extramarital sex, though not as frequently. The dangers of engaging in sexual relations with a black man instead of a white man were immense, especially given the risk of producing a mixed-race child. Although 19th century birth control and abortion methods were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today, they did exist. Condoms made from animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy. During much of the 19th century, abortion was largely unregulated and not limited to poor, immigrant, or black women. Upper and middle-class white women also had abortions. This allowed white women to have affairs with black men with some confidence that they would not be caught. It is also possible that these affairs were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it might have been somewhat expected that white men would transgress morally by having sexual relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have sex with a black man might not have been considered likely. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could easily accuse the slave of rape to protect herself. Because black men were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice, it was easier for an elite woman to accuse a black man of rape than a white man. White women who were discovered to have had affairs with slaves often faced significant public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was found to be pregnant by a slave, great efforts were made to conceal the pregnancy. Sometimes the resulting child was sold into slavery, but infanticide was not uncommon as a way to avoid scandal. However, not all attempts to avoid scandal were successful. In his 1837 autobiography, former slave Charles Ball recounts encountering the daughter of a wealthy planter in one of the lower counties of Georgia who had given birth to a mixed-race son. The family initially considered sending her out of state until the birth, but instead, the girl was kept in her father's house until the birth of her child, which she was not permitted to nurse, it being taken from her. She was subsequently degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery. Few scholars have examined relationships between enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, largely due to assumptions about gendered sexual power dynamics. This perspective aligns with traditional views of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, which often overlooks women's potential for sexual offenses and dominance. However, increasing evidence suggests that women can also commit sexual abuse for control and domination. Accounts reveal instances where bright-looking colored men were coerced into sexual relations by white women, including mistresses and others of similar status. For instance, one former slave recounted being compelled by his mistress to sleep with her following her husband's death. In her work, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1867. Jacobs highlights how daughters of plantation owners exploited male slaves. They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. The story of the young white woman described here, as depicted by Jacobs, illustrates sexually predatory behavior, even if she may not have seen it that way. Such relationships, as Jacobs suggests, were not uncommon and cannot be considered consensual in any meaningful sense. Rather, they constitute sexual abuse, if not rape. This demonstrates that, like their male counterparts, plantation mistresses and elite women had the ability to exercise sexual control and exploit their slaves. Another method through which white women exerted sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they resisted their advances. This tactic leveraged patriarchal notions that women were weak and in need of male protection and control, extending this control to include racial domination over slaves. Instead of challenging the patriarchal system oppressing both slaves and, to a lesser extent, white women, these predatory women perpetuated white supremacy and patriarchy by reinforcing paternalistic ideas about female sexuality. The motivations behind why these women chose to sexually exploit slaves likely varied. Some may have acted out of boredom or sexual frustration, while for others, it may have been a subconscious attempt to compensate for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. In a society where planter-class women were considered their husband's property and had limited sexual agency compared to men, exploiting slaves sexually may have provided a sense of power and enjoyment. Sexual abuse by white women towards slave men cannot be excused, nor does it imply that such abuse would not have occurred if women held higher social status. In the context of a society where slave-owning white women frequently expressed frustrations through excessive cruelty and violence towards slaves, it is likely they also used sex as a tool for domination and control. This behavior reflected their relative powerlessness in a patriarchal society. The topic of upper-class white women engaging in sex with and sexually abusing male slaves remains largely overlooked in scholarly discourse. Hood's work, White Women, Black Men, stands as the solitary comprehensive study on this subject. Most literature on antebellum slaveholding society either briefly acknowledges these relationships or, like Clinton's The Plantation Mistress, dismisses the notion of upper-class women having sexual interactions with slaves. While these relationships were less common than those between male masters and slave women, they were equally complex, problematic, potentially exploitative, and merit thorough scholarly examination. So, what have we learned about the complex dynamics of relationships between upper-class white women and male slaves in antebellum America? Despite receiving scant scholarly attention, these interactions were not only real but also deeply impactful. While most historical accounts focus on relationships between white men and black women, the experiences of white women engaging in sexual relations with male slaves were no less significant, complex, or exploitative. Hood's groundbreaking book, White Women, Black Men, remains a vital resource in shedding light on this overlooked aspect of history. It challenges us to rethink traditional narratives and confront uncomfortable truths about power, agency, and exploitation within the hierarchy of antebellum society. As we continue to explore and discuss these lesser-known histories, it becomes clear that understanding these dynamics is crucial for a more complete picture of the complexities of slavery and race relations in America. These stories, however uncomfortable, are integral to our understanding of the past and its lasting impact on the present. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more deep dives into overlooked aspects of our shared history. Until next time, take care and keep questioning the narratives we inherit.